recent Air France disaster. It's time we take financial world as seriously.
Well, let's go to Q&A, and let's try and keep the questions concise and not speeches, but questions, because this is a great opportunity to have somebody here on stage to talk with you. And this is a public forum, and the idea is to give the public as much access to these interesting people that we do bring to town. So the gentleman beside you, right there, yeah.
I understand Barney Frank 5-10 years ago was pushing very hard for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae to go into subprime, and pushing them to push the banks to push. This was a way to get a lot of people into homes. So I haven't heard tonight government's source of problem. Government as a regulator, as a solver, I've heard, but I see a lot of government source here as a cause. Can you address that?
Sure. There are two things that people generally try to argue in terms of the government as there's three things, as a source of the crisis. The first is Greenspan's easy money policies, right? So they blame him for keeping interest rates very, very low. That has some truth in the sense that it aggravated it a bit. In other words, it made leverage cheaper. And the greater the leverage, the greater the bubble, and the greater the loss. So there's some truth, but that's still pretty marginal. The second thing that people sometimes argue as government as source is the Community Reinvestment Act, right? That has nothing to do with this. That one's pure made up. How do we know that it has nothing to do with it? Well, first, it's been in place for, I think, close to 30 years at this point. So if it was going to produce disasters, it's not a very good explanation of a current crisis. Second, 80% of the non-prime loans were made by non-regulated entities not subject to the Community Reinvestment Act. So obviously their behavior wasn't in any way prompted by the Community Reinvestment Act. Third, the institutions that were regulated and were subject to the Community Reinvestment Act, none of them had any CRA rating problems. So they weren't making these loans to try to improve their ratings. They all had great ratings already. Fourth, what changed in CRA regulation over the recent period relevant to the crisis? It was weakened, not strengthened, right? As a result of Phil Graham's actions, primarily as part of the law that repealed Glass-Steagall, the Graham Bleach-Lively. They also weakened the law on CRA. And then under the Bush administration, does anyone seriously think the Bush administration made enforcing the Community Reinvestment Act a regulatory priority? No. Did they regulate anything effectively in safety and soundness, which is what they were concentrating on? No. I assure you there was nothing coming on the CRA side. So that one is completely made up. The third one is Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie do have a role in this crisis, but it's not the one that most people think about. Fannie and Freddie, ironically, were the primary reason we didn't have a crisis in subprime much earlier, because Fannie and Freddie only purchase prime mortgages for packaging. And Fannie and Freddie's standards for prime mortgages, in general, are very good. That's a conforming mortgage in jargon. And so in the old days, the non-prime folks couldn't sell their stuff because only Fannie and Freddie could buy it. What changed? We passed a law that allowed what we call private label folks to create mortgage-backed securities. So these are primarily investment banks. And it's the investment banks that purchased the non-prime loans and then sent it to the rating agencies, like I said, and got the AAAs. So it's overwhelmingly, again, a story of actually the weakening of the creation of competitors to Fannie and Freddie that led to this. But Fannie and Freddie did purchase not loans, not subprime loans, but these exotic derivatives that got the AAA ratings, primarily liar's loans. And it did so, of course, at a time when the agency had full regulating it, which was then OFEO, had full regulatory authority to stop it, and was run by a conservative or Republican. And not only did he not stop it, he thought this wasn't risky. So, and it is true that the administration, the Bush administration, strongly pushed this stuff.
But that was the ownership
Through
society.
the FHA.
Yeah, but the ownership
That was the
society.
ownership society and such.
And it ended up that it's the biggest transfer of wealth from the poor and working class in history.
Right. So Barney Frank was definitely a supporter of Fannie and Freddie. He's far from alone. It's bipartisan support in Congress and strong support from the Bush administration, and probably would have been strong support from the Obama administration as well, except that they pretty much ruined their reputation. But they are massively insolvent because of the CDOs they purchased.
Okay, on this side, the second gentleman in next from where you are. The second one. You're the first. But
Thanks. Hi.
But you're number one, even if you don't get to ask.
You get to be next. I worked with back in the mid-'90s, and I asked the guys at the Office of Thrift Supervision, why didn't they let the S&Ls go bankrupt? And they would never answer the question until I was on the elevator with my boss one time, just he and I alone, and he said, John, very simple. We were terrified the entire system would collapse. I said, so you're telling me you let Bill Simon, all these guys, buy those assets 10 cents on the dollar and flip them 30 days later? He said, yeah, we were terrified the banking system collapsed. And so that, to me, seems one of the biggest concerns of why these people have done what they've done. But I have another question. On the weekend of 12 September last year, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy at 2 o'clock on the morning of Monday, the 15th of January. By 12 noon, JP Morgan Chase had transferred to them, it's like 80-some-odd billion dollars. Okay, they transferred back to Lehman. Then by 5 o'clock that same day, the Federal Reserve Bank, through Geithner, reimbursed JP Morgan Chase for that $80 billion. They did the same thing the next day. Lehman was technically in bankruptcy as of 2 o'clock Monday morning, yet they're getting paid by JP Morgan Chase. Federal Reserve is reimbursing them. I've never heard of that before in my life. I've queried the guys at Bloomberg and others. No one seems to know what the hell is going on here. What happened?
Okay. So the first one, we spent the insurance fund down to $500 million. We were insuring supposedly $1 trillion in deposits. And it happened because the administration, I'm talking, by the way, this is 1986, 87. And we used all that money to close the worst control frauds. So we were operating on fumes. And indeed, we did worry every morning that there would be a nationwide run. But President Reagan refused to allow us, A, to say that the insurance fund was insolvent, and B, to seek any public funds. So, that was our constraint, and we did the best we could under that constraint. I don't know the facts on your point. The most obvious thing is there may have been overnight funds, right? And if they were overnight funds, then you would have to ship them back the next day under what's called the automatic stay provisions of the bankruptcy laws. So it's conceivable that it's less conspiratorial than you think. But if there was, in fact, a federal guarantee paid out, that would indeed be very interesting. The broader point that, are the Fed and Treasury working with the big banks, hand in glove? Yeah, of course they are.
And aren't they favoring Goldman Sachs? That's the alumni seems to be.
Yeah. Well, they favor friends of Goldman, FOGs.
Right.
So.
The lady in the back there, just behind you there with a hand up. Yes.
I just had a comment. What is this doing to our nonprofits? If you look at the board of directors of all the big nonprofits, they're all these criminal CEOs, and they don't just behave this way and govern this way by day and then put on a different hat.
Well, sure they do.
I don't hear enough said that these people are considered pillars of society, and what are they doing to our nonprofits?
Well, there can be pillars of salt, if I remember the Bible correctly. And yeah,